Welcome to all of you joining us online for this update on our global campaign to remove the Islamic Republic of Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. I'm Alyse Nelson. I'm President and CEO here at Vital Voices. Let me just set the stage for those of you who maybe are not familiar with what the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women is and why, quite frankly, it is so appalling that Iran is a member. The Commission on the Status of Women is a global body, one of the most significant global bodies dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment. Iran began a 4-year term on the United Nations 45-member commission earlier this year. But we believe that certainly the Islamic Republic of Iran's longstanding systemic oppression of women really should have disqualified them from election to this important body. On Sunday, as some of you may have seen, Vital Voices, along with a coalition of Iranian women and an artist collective called For Freedoms, took out a center spread in the New York Times. And we called in this petition for Iran's removal from the Commission on the Status of Women. Among the many signers were Hillary Clinton, our founder, Michelle Obama, Laura Bush, Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, among many, many more. You also can sign on to the letter at womanlifefreedom.today. womanlifefreedom.today. And we encourage you to do so. Here to discuss this today, we have two signers with us, human rights lawyer Gissou and women's rights activist, author, and humanitarian Zainab Salbi. I'll be talking with them for the next hour, and if you have questions, you can send them to media@vitalvoices.org. That's media@vitalvoices.org for your questions, and hopefully we can get to all of them. Gissou, I know that you are in constant contact with those inside Iran, with many of those protesting and women activists. Can you give us a lay of the land of what is going on right now inside the country?
Definitely. Thank you so much for convening this, and I'm really glad to be with you all. So I think probably a lot of folks here would know how these protests began last month, or rather in September, with the tragic killing of Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was arrested by the Islamic Republic of Iran's so-called morality police, and she later died in their custody. And the photo of her bruised and battered body lying sort of, lifeless in a hospital bed is really what triggered this spate of protests, first in her hometown of Saqqez, which is in the Kurdish region in Iran, and then it spread nationwide. We now have protests in all 31 of Iran's provinces. There are hundreds of individual demonstrations that have been recorded. And unfortunately, as is inevitable with any spate of protests in the country, the state security forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran have been cracking down very harshly on these protesters. They have arrested thousands of people. The counts are upwards of 13,000 plus. They have killed numerous people. We're now in a count of hundreds, though it's very difficult to verify exact numbers. It's a pretty high number of folks. And there have been a lot of preemptive arrests as well. So some of the leading civil society activists that I know, other thought leaders like rapper Tumaj Salehi, who was just kidnapped by the Islamic Republic the other day, these folks are all being arrested, and the security forces in the state probably assume that this is a way to quell the protests. But because there is no one single leader of these protests, their efforts have so far been unsuccessful. We saw that the other day on the 40th day of mourning, which is significant in Iranian culture, but the 40th day of mourning after Mahsa Jina Amini had passed, there were again protests across the country in more than 30 cities. So what I think the images that a lot of people have probably seen are of women and girls taking off their mandatory hijab and proudly just going about their day and securing their bodily autonomy in the way that they want, but that the state currently says is criminal, that this is a criminal offense. So happy to dig in more, but that's the current state of affairs at the moment.
Great. Thank you so much. Zainab, I want to turn to you because you, of course, are one of the women leaders who signed on to the petition, to the letter that appeared in the New York Times on Sunday. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so significant that so many women leaders, and not just former women presidents, Nobel laureates who have a bit more freedom than those in the government, but women leaders, sitting in government positions, the deputy Prime Minister of Canada, the Foreign Minister of Canada, and now Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Why is it so significant? I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything gain so much momentum so quickly. I mean, it was phenomenal to see.
Well, thank you so much, Alyse. And before I go and answer your question, I really want to acknowledge your leadership in this momentum and Vital Voices team and leaders in making that happen and creating that solidarity among women. All of us had the privilege to, of course, join and ask other women to join, but it's really your leadership in mobilizing this. So thank you for that. And it's interesting because usually it's former serving officials who sign, who feel more comfortable on that. I have to say I was surprised when we got the first response from the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada saying absolutely yes within minutes of being asked. She's like, okay, let's responding fast, and within 24 hours they confirmed. I think it is for me a reflection of few things. One, of the solidarity among women. I mean, we always talk about if women lead the world, it will be better. I don't know if we have a solidarity among women leaders, and that is significant. And these are women leaders, not only formally in office, but currently in office. And that is a huge statement of solidarity. But obviously, this is usually they wouldn't do that only for that. I think it's a reflection of governments understanding that women's voices in Iran and in other regions are very, very important in this pivotal moment. The world community is trying to, it's a very tricky renegotiations always with Iran, and in terms of so many levels. And I think that movement, and this is the first time, as was mentioned earlier, that there is a movement in about 10 years, that is a significant movement, not only for Iranian women, but also for Iran and for relationships generally, for many countries that are trying to find a way to deal with Iran. It's also a very tricky thing because it's a reflection. There is a very many interesting analysis that the Iranian government doesn't want a full opening with the Western world and doesn't want full closing with the Western world. It wants sort of a middle where it's enough breathing room that it can feed the minimum, it does the minimum for its population, but not complete openness that it will be threatening to its existence. So what you have right now with this women-led revolution is actually a pushing forward for more openness. And that's why the government is so threatened, and they're using the violence and the killing that they've used in the last 40 plus days at the moment, So I think it's a reflection of world leaders understanding that this is an important opening for a potential change in Iran. The women voices are important. And in my opinion, this is a non-violent revolution, at least from the Iranian population. And, we have tried, Western leaders have tried so many things, wars in Afghanistan, army, killing, they haven't worked. I really believe that the future of change in our world is going to come in peaceful revolutions, and mostly it's going to come from women and the youth in general. And this is a demonstration that it is possible. We just need to endorse them, push and do whatever we can to keep their voices echoed around the world, rather than just admire them from afar.
It is so important to keep the pressure and momentum going, because Gissou, as I know you will tell us, you're the legal expert here, it's, changing anything with many governments within the UN system, it isn't easy. There isn't any precedent for this exactly. How difficult is it going to be? Lay out for us what that path could potentially will look like.
Yeah. So this is a frequent question that we've received over, what is the process whereby the Islamic Republic of Iran will actually be removed from the CSW? we've seen that countries have been suspended on the Human Rights Council, and that is because in the founding document for the Human Rights Council, there is a provision for suspension. And suspension just means you're suspended, as in the case of Russia over, in this past year. They also then chose to quit, which then allowed the seat to be filled by a different state. And so that was much appreciated from them to also take that extra step. Otherwise, it would just kind of be in limbo. And of course, we also saw a suspension with Libya in 2011. With the CSW, the issue is that there is no provision about suspension or removal in the founding document. And indeed, there's no precedent for any of the functional commissions that are part of ECOSOC, which is the parent body to the CSW. But as I've been saying, just because it's unprecedented doesn't mean it can't be done. And there is a first time for everything. Now, a lot of UN member states, indeed, practically every UN member state, has spots on its human rights record. No state is perfect. We know this. And that's why there's a universal periodic review process that's about to kick off, I think, next week, if I'm not mistaken, that assesses the human rights record of every country. But there are also outliers. And I think we need to recognize that the Islamic Republic of Iran, being on the top UN body that's supposed to shape, the gender equality agenda, while the Islamic Republic of Iran is 164 out of 167 countries, I think, on the gender gap index, something like this. Anyway, they're at the bottom, is a major problem. And so I think we have an outlier here. Now, some folks have asked, well, I think Afghanistan is on the CSW. So what about that? It's noteworthy that the Taliban has never been accredited as the representatives before the UN. So that's a different set of representatives from the former government. They are not representing the Taliban. And Saudi Arabia is not on the CSW. So really, the Islamic Republic of Iran is the outlier. There are other countries that, of course, have misogyny, patriarchy, that's a global issue. But the laws in the IRI enshrine gender discrimination. And that is something that we really need to stand against. So how it would happen, there could either be a vote through ECOSOC, the parent body, a member state on ECOSOC, one of the 54 members would have to advance a resolution. It could be a group of states that do that. I'll note that New Zealand is part of ECOSOC, and I think we saw some very strong leadership from the Prime Minister on that. Canada is part of ECOSOC. Again, we saw, sitting members of government signing on to that letter. So it would be great to see a group of states. I would love to see some of the states represented in the Africa bloc, in the Latin America bloc, and perhaps even the Asia bloc also taking a leadership role, because this is a global issue. This is not an issue that is just being advanced by Western states. We see that there's a feminist uprising inside the country of Iran, and we need to start acknowledging this as a global issue. So it can be through ECOSOC or it could be through the General Assembly. I think it would be much more strategic for it to be through ECOSOC because you're dealing with less states. It might be an easier process, but that's the technicalities.
Yeah. And just a follow-on question has come in from Michelle Kellerman from NPR, who's joining us. She's interested in a mechanism for getting Iran off the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Will there have to be a General Assembly vote, as you just addressed, or is there another way? And maybe just talk a little bit to what does that instrument or that mechanism look like?
Yeah, so I was, talking about this, and then I see that there's a question that's like right on the money. So indeed, there could either be a General Assembly vote or there could be this vote in ECOSOC. And with the General Assembly, you're dealing with 193 states. So I have to say, to me, that's not really the advantageous path. But depending on vote counts and who's willing to advance things, that's a strategic decision that, will have to be made. But we definitely want the momentum to be moving quickly on this. What I will say is that a resolution does need to be tabled. So there needs to be a state that's either part of, let's just say part of ECOSOC, because we want to move forward that way, but to have a state part of ECOSOC that will put that forward and sort of demonstrate leadership. And then there will be other states that would need to demarche, would need to marshal votes in support of such a resolution. Because the worst outcome, not the worst, but like a not favorable outcome would be to table a resolution and to have it not be successful. I
Right.
think that would be a really that would be extremely troubling in these times, and probably would be more an indictment of the system than anything else. But I think we also need to look at other issues, like how did the Islamic Republic of Iran get on the CSW in the first place? How come there was a non-competitive election? How come the Asia Bloc wasn't encouraged to advance a different candidate so that the IRI was not guaranteed a slot? How come this wasn't a pressing issue in 2021 when they were elected? Because there could have been more efforts to ensure that they were prevented from getting on the commission at that point. But now we need to correct for what has been done.
Please, can I add in here,
Yes.
because what Gissou is saying is so, so important. And I just want to, just the Western world have lost a lot of moral credibility in the last, decade or so, and especially in the last few years. And there's a lot of cynicism from not only the Islamic Republic of Iran, throughout governments in the Middle East and Asia about the power that the Western world or the UN used to have in terms of, wanting to please, or wanting at least to be on the right line. What Gissou is saying is so pivotally important, because it's showing a solidarity not only coming from the West, but it's coming from the UN body. I mean, that whole idea of mobilizing African countries, Canadian, as well as Australia, New Zealand, is so important, because it's sort of in a world of cynicism. It's basically showing, no, this is really important. And there's a lot of cynicism when it comes to women's issues. Oh, this is all talk. Let's just do token things and please the West or please the UN to sort of leave us alone. What this mobilization is pivotal to sort of counteract the cynicism that is among many leaders. It's a very widespread cynicism that is coming out of the Middle East, out of Asia, in terms of the looking into this part of the world. So it's so important that saying, no, this is not just symbolic. We're not talking, we are actually acting on it. And this is serious.
I also think it's very inspiring that, you think about the leadership that we've seen from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, right? And also Canada's leadership, obviously having a deputy prime minister that's a woman, as well as a foreign minister who's a woman, who both of whom, as I mentioned before, signed on to the letter. Talk a little bit, if you can, Gissou, about the significance of the New Zealand government saying on Monday that it has suspended its official bilateral human rights dialogue with Iran, saying that the bilateral approaches were no longer tenable, with basic human rights being denied in the country.
Yeah, so this is a sort of ongoing debate about when is engagement constructive and when is it not? When does it actually lead to a continuation of violations versus when it could actually encourage reform? So I think this applies to a lot of human rights violating states. And the question is always, is it better to keep open that type of communication? And, I saw some questions actually about whether it was better for the IRI to stay on the Commission on the Status of Women so that they can be encouraged to actually, reform. But that accommodationist rationale only works when there actually is a path for reform on those issues. I'll note that back in 2010, there was the Islamic Republic of Iran was maybe going to get on the newly formed UN Women, and they were going to be on the governing body for that. But at the time, Samantha Power was not in favor of this and really rallied to ensure that the Islamic Republic of Iran did not have a leadership role on that body. So I'm just going to say that there's been a long history of this. We see that they're very rigid on those laws. And for those who don't know, I'll just throw a few of them out there. If I was, I have an Iranian passport. If I was in Iran, my testimony would be worth half that of a man in a courtroom. I could be stoned for adultery. I would not have the same marriage, divorce, inheritance, or custody rights as a man. I would be very restricted in that way. So these are serious things we're talking about. The mandatory hijab laws, which mandate that women and girls in the country have to essentially wear a head covering and loose clothing by the age of puberty, which is interpreted in different ways. That's just the most visible symbol of a very deeply entrenched gender discriminatory framework. And it has only gotten more rigid under the administration of Ibrahim Raisi, the current president. And the morality police was sort of strictly enforcing all these things, and women really felt the crunch. And so there's only room for engagement when it's leading to somewhere. And I think we're not seeing that. So I fully commend the states that are making decisions to not, whitewash or somehow be aiding in the Islamic Republic of Iran putting out an image to the world that somehow it cares about these issues. We're not seeing that. And what the women are asking for inside the country is a wholesale change. And so we should honor what they're saying and not play, cozy with the state that's doing this to them.
So Zainab, you signed on to this letter, of course, immediately, not surprising to me, but, coming from the region, growing up in Iraq, how do you view that relationship with Iran? And obviously, thinking about dialogue, no dialogue, where's your stance on this based on, growing up in the region and then coming to the United States?
Well, I mean, again, what Gissou is saying is truly very, very important. And though in different countries have slightly different rules vis-a-vis women, and whether it's in Iraq or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, whatever, more or less what she's describing in terms of a testimony of women equals 2 women equals 1 man, no inheritance right, not equal inheritance rights. Men again get double what women get, no equal divorce rights or custody rights or mobility, and all of these things. These are throughout the region, right? We have a moment right now where truly, in my opinion, women are pivotally important in moving this needle. Now, you and I, Alyse, were very involved in the evacuation of Afghan women leaders last year, right? And in my belief, though, and then there are many of them who stayed in the country and decided to fight from within the country. In my belief, the future of change that is happening is going to come from women. It truly is going to come from women. And it's they keep on going to try until a change actually takes place. So it's so important for me as an Arab Muslim Iraqi women to see the success of Iranian women, because it can lead to a snowball of effect, basically, throughout the region, of women looking at each other and saying, okay, they could do this, so we can do this. Because the laws or the treatment of women in laws throughout the Middle East are very similar. Diverse, not all countries force women to wear headscarf except for Iran. Actually, even Saudi Arabia let loose of that, right? But the laws, the fundamental rights and fundamental laws are very similar to each other. So I'm watching it not only as a feminist and as a women's rights activist and all of that. I'm watching it also as a Muslim woman from the Middle East, saying this is so important. I believe a lot of young women are watching the same thing. And so we need Iranian women to succeed, not only for Iranian women, which is the most important thing at the moment, of course, but, there's a desire also for me them to succeed for the larger Muslim women population and the larger women population in the entire Middle East. It's very interconnected if we see one of the women population evolving in the change and creating that change. And I believe it could truly create a ripple effect on the region.
I know. I think it's been so incredibly inspiring to all of us at Vital Voices, and I know our global network across 184 countries. We've heard from so many of them, because it really is young women. It is this rising generation of young women who are saying, no, I'm going to define my own future. And, as we've seen in some of those initial reports, children being killed, the average age I saw of those arrested, at least in the early days, was 15. Wow, right? This is truly girls, young women getting out there and fighting for their rights so courageously. And there's a question that's come in from one of our audience members, basically asking, and Gissou, I'll pose this to you, but Zainab, feel free to jump in as well. What other organizations and agencies can be helpful in putting pressure on the regime and help us amplify the voices of Iranian women? And they mentioned UNICEF, obviously, because of this issue of so many children, being injured, dying, arrested as part of this.
So there are dozens of children who have been killed. The thing is, we saw these images of these young protesters, girls as young as 12, taking off their mandatory hijab and sort of waving it in the air and chanting like "death to the dictator," and in schools, right? And so we saw tons of this video. And I think for a lot of us, we thought, well, surely the regime is not going to kill a bunch of young schoolgirls. We thought, I mean, come on, like there has to be a red line somewhere. And unfortunately, that is not the case. They have killed 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, beautiful young girls who had active TikTok accounts. Like these would be people that are indistinguishable from, just kids that we know, and it just is truly horrific. What the families have been through is horrific. Some of these girls whose photos went viral, who weren't killed but were involved with others who were, have now been forced to flee the country because they're in great danger. And so it's just truly horrific. But in terms of what can happen, I did see that a board member of UNICEF had pushed for a statement. I think the issue with a lot of these international bodies and also parts of the UN is that they want access to the territories. So they do work in the country, whether that's ICRC, UNICEF, Relief International, or other humanitarian and aid organizations. And so they're generally pretty reticent about issuing statements or looking like they're taking some kind of position because it will lead to their staff being expelled. But I think when it comes to these young, beautiful souls being killed in this way, there does need to be stronger condemnation or also an active framework for how to put an end to this immediately. We should not be seeing any further killings of children. I will note that juvenile executions are on the books in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they actually do execute children for a range of offenses. But the global community has put such pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran on that particular issue. Every year at the Human Rights Council, this is constantly brought up, that, it's at least given them some degree of pause, or at least force them to sort of, use it maybe a bit more sparingly than they would otherwise, which could just be completely unabated. So a similar effort really needs to happen here, where there's just a focus on these women and girls not being harmed. They're reportedly being sent to re-education centers. And, we're getting really concerning reports of sexual assault and violence. And so we do need our global bodies to take a much stronger stance. It can't just be, statements of concern. We need action. We need a UN investigative mechanism to be set up ASAP to be looking at these violations. It's really key and critical.
Yes.
Can I add, Alyse? I mean, I think just to add, we need also, I think our job as individual citizens, those of us who are not as well versed in the UN bodies and other official bodies, just to keep it going, just keep echoing the voices of Iranian women outside. And whether that is by us going in the streets and echoing their voices, making sure that the media continue to cover that story, making sure that we use our social media to do that. That is one way to keep the story. We need to keep the story alive. That is our job. one of our jobs outside of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we need to ensure that their voices are continuing to be on the headline news and heard in the media and in every way, shape, or form. So that is for the citizens like myself, that is our job. That's how we need to mobilize, and it has to be worldwide. So if you have a network in different countries, in different cities, and just constantly mobilize women and ask them to go out and out and out and keep pressure on their local government or their country government to keep that front and center of their foreign policy agenda.
I think that's so critically important. And I'll just say again, for everyone joining us, you can send questions to media@vitalvoices.org. If you have some, we'll be sure to get to them. And please go and sign the petition. It is at the website I mentioned earlier, womanlifefreedom.today. Womanlifefreedom.today. I think one of the things, just to echo what you were saying earlier, Zainab, that we saw very early on was so many, obviously incredible voices from inside and saying, don't send money, we just need you to echo our voices, amplify our voices, keep it going. And we want to know that American women are listening, that women, in Nigeria are listening, that women throughout Latin America are listening, right? That we as women around the world will respond and will stand for them. And, you think about certainly the power of technology and the ability to make that happen. Why do you think that is so important, in particular, in a country where obviously, the internet has been, shut down, why is that so important that people are out there amplifying, particularly in this case?
I'm not sure if that question from me or Gissou, and I'll take a quick step at it, and I'll hand it over to you, Gissou, but because I'm not from Iran, right? And I'm not, I can't speak on behalf of what's happening in the country. What I do know is I am very familiar with the region itself. The governments of the region, generally, I'm generalizing, throughout the Middle East, do care about their international reputation. They do, and this is a fine line. They do care about what the world is saying. They do care if there are moments in the streets and people are demonstrating and, putting pressure on them. That public sentiment is important. It's not oblivious to them. And the fact, and what I love about the letter, it was really signed by a diversity of women. It does matter that it's not only this woman or that woman from this country or that. There's a diversity of women from all over the world and all over ethnicities and different races and all of that joining in that. They do care. Their public image matters, But Gissou, you have more of an informed opinion, particularly as it relates to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
I think my audio cut out for maybe 15 seconds on the exact prompt, but was it, Alyse, it was about whether or not the IRI can change, right? Or what?
Yeah, and I think what I was really wanting to understand is why, in particular, in this case, is it so important to amplify the voices, right? I think more than anywhere in the world, like that was the sort of clarion call, please, amplify our voices. Don't send money, amplify our voices. And I think that's extremely powerful.
Okay, so that is what I thought. It's so important. I could probably talk about this for an entire hour. I will talk about it for 30 seconds or a minute. Basically, the immediate need was not for money. Now, of course, there's an argument that building an economic base among the striking workers might help with getting some of the demands met, but that's a separate issue. The reason that we want to amplify the voices is because the propaganda of dictatorships is so strong. They tell the world at the UN and on the global stage that these are cultural issues, that our women are happy being in the home. That is their choice. That is our way of life. Keep in mind, there are no women saying that. There's maybe one or two women who are in the government alongside them to sort of echo these statements. This isn't based on polling. This isn't based on free and fair elections. This isn't based on a free press where women are actually able to freely say what they want or not want. This is not based on any vibrant civil society. None of it. It's a bunch of men saying that this is what our women want. And there's no women input, and we do not see them on the global stage typically. What is so important is showing, wow, these are women all across the country, across socioeconomic backgrounds, from a range of ethnicities, from the Kurdish region to the Baluch region, like all over the country. Some of the women are from conservative families, and you can tell because when they take their headscarf off, some of them have very, very long hair, and some more conservative families don't cut the hair of the girls and things like that. So it is truly across the spectrum. And essentially all they're saying is that we want bodily autonomy. We just want simple freedoms. To dress as we please, to socialize as we please, to listen to the music that we please. That's really it. And so seeing that is so powerful. And I think that those images and seeing those videos are what has really stirred some of the countries in the Africa bloc at the UN, in the Latin America bloc, in the Asia bloc, who typically are a bit weary of sort of looking like, they're imposing a certain way of life or they're stepping on toes, and who are a bit weary of the big powers and country-specific resolutions and mechanisms and rapporteurs. And as smaller countries, some of them are also wary of it because they're worried about it being turned on them. This has actually really, really unified a lot of these countries who, a lot of their governments are very strong proponents of women's rights, even if they have challenges domestically and all that, but the governments themselves are very in support of this. So that's really helped unify, I think, this call, and that's what's so important. And I'll just note one last thing is that for the first time ever at the UN Human Rights Council, we had Chile, we had a non-Western country draft and lead a statement, a joint statement on human rights violations in Iran. That happened a few weeks ago. That was the first time ever. And I think that really shows the geographical breadth of what we're dealing with and the support that is coming from all corners of the globe.
Please, can I just add quickly, because there's a question about students being worried about how to demonstrate or how to support and being sensitive about cultural appropriation and performative activism. There is I would just to address that question, there is a line, and it's a fine line, and it can be addressed with education and awareness and to actively listen and understand each other between performative activism and between supporting each other, because we cannot, in the name of fear, whether we are insulting another culture, whatever, not show up. We've got to show up. And this is a moment where truly all of us must show up. We need to show up for them. We need to show up for ourselves as well. It is interconnected. But in that same, how do you show up is a question. It's not whether students show up or not. Is, one of the, and Gissou, I'm really interested in your opinion, but as a Muslim woman, showing up for me is as offensive for me when I hear people's like, they see all headscarf as being oppressive. It's about the freedom. This is about the freedom to choose. Not all Muslim women, I'm not talking about Iran, I'm talking about my familiarity. Some Muslim women choose to wear the headscarf, their decision, their variety of reasons why they do that, by the way. In this case, it is about being forced to do it. And it's not about the headscarf, it's about all their rights. And all their dignities, and it's not only women. I love, as there's an iconic song for the Iranian Revolution right now that I can't stop crying every time I hear it. And it says it's not only for women, but it is also for the shame of not having money. It's for the Afghan kids who are begging in the streets, for the fathers who cannot protect their girls. It is about dignity, and it is about basic freedom that they're asking for. And that's why they've been joined with so many men. So for those who are in America or in different different countries around the world, it's actually, you must go and show up. Please do not be afraid, but show up with respect to the complexities of the culture. Do not judge all women who are wearing headscarf or Muslim as being oppressed. This is respect their choices, Do not become the other direction of oppressing them by marginalizing them and stereotyping them, right? And that's the nuances that people are afraid of, I guess. And that's what I'm, just saying, call, talk, listen, explore, but support and show up in all ways,
That's such an important point, Zainab, because it is so much about choice, right? I want to take another question that's come in. How can we support the strikers' economic base when funds cannot be sent into the country? Are there any organizations that have been able to facilitate this? So I know you mentioned that, Gissou, so I'm gonna ask you if you have anywhere to point people to.
Yeah, it's a super complex issue legally because you cannot, because of US broad-based economic sanctions, you can't actually easily send funds into the country. So I think one of the critiques of, broad-based economic sanctions policy is how it sometimes inadvertently or intentionally leads to outcomes that are really actually not helpful for the society and for the people. And sometimes it also enriches representatives in government because they thrive off of a black market. So, I'll just say that there are efforts that are being made, some of them through perhaps cryptocurrency, things I can't really get into details on, but there are definitely efforts to do this. And there are also groups that can get OFAC licenses to do some of this. And I think it's not about, fomenting change or anything like this. It's just obviously a lot of people are not in a good economic situation in Iran because inflation is sky high. So how would we expect striking workers at oil, striking oil workers to sustain that pace if they're going to need to collect a paycheck? So these are just practical questions, but there are efforts underway to be able to support, more or less support activists in the country in the ways that they need to be able to continue to do their activism.
And just to add on that, I mean, never underestimate the power of women networks. And I'm talking beyond Iran. It's amazing over and over and over again when you support the women, the power of women network. I'm talking financial support. There is a mechanism that women have found to support each other, to send each other's money, to release each other, to help each other. It's sort of, for me, this is a moment in time that's echo the idea that we have to move from seeing women's issues and women's rights as a marginal issues to support in a nice way, to see it as this is a true game changer in here for nations, for countries, for populations, and that women's network supporting them in all their manifestations is actually important part of this in getting supports in various fungible ways to their own surroundings, basically. So again, it's not a clear answer, but as much as saying invest in women's organizations generally, because they do have a way to actually get to each other and support each other financially within each country that is hard otherwise to get money to.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Tara Kangarlu. She asks, how can the global community make sure that this is not just another publicity campaign where it doesn't lead to producing more harm to people on the ground and the regime's brutal crackdown, and most importantly, result in tangible, immediate, and sustainable change?
Happy to tackle that one. We touched on it a bit in the beginning, which is really that Iranian women in the country are outraged that the Islamic Republic of Iran is on the CSW. First of all, they actually don't really think the United Nations is of any use. So I should just say that as a baseline, like that's how they feel most likely. I'm not saying for all, but a lot of them. And I feel that's how some people think because of the political bodies at the UN. I think that gets a lot of media attention. We see this collection of world leaders gather in New York every year and make statements and all that, right? So it's a bit about the political bodies and the politics. It's not really acknowledging the great work that a lot of UN agencies do that are involved in documenting atrocities, involved in bringing food to conflict zones all over the world, like World Food Program does, right? But there's just a general sense of fatigue, which I think was in large part an effect of the horrific way that the Syrian conflict was dealt with. I think that really signed, it's a very dark chapter, I think, and there's some bodies at the UN that are completely paralyzed, like the UN Security Council. I think that's why we see the UN Human Rights Council, where I actually do a lot of advocacy, being more of a leader on a lot of these issues because it doesn't suffer from the same kind of paralysis. But in terms of this being another publicity campaign, I think it's just a baseline that the IRI shouldn't be on. And the body itself hasn't done a lot in terms of helping the Islamic Republic of Iran reform their laws. We had gotten into this discussion about an accommodationist rationale, whether or not it's better to engage versus not. I think here it's pretty clear it hasn't really done what we seek it to do. And instead, we see lots of side events on the margins of these different UN meetings where the state is talking about how the women's rightful place is in the domestic sphere, and really just putting out a lot of narrative shaping and shaping of the norms. And shaping of the norms have an effect. They actually have an effect at these bodies. We do see that other states do that as well. I won't get into examples of, into specific examples here. That could be a whole other webinar, but that shaping of norms has a real effect. And that's why it should not be allowed here. I will note that there are plenty of other efforts that are going to, I think, result in those kinds of very productive, substantive, from the outside kind of support changes that we need, like setting up a UN investigative mechanism and a whole range of other actions. But this is just a baseline, very fundamental thing that should be done immediately, really.
Yeah.
And I don't see any benefit in them staying on. And I think most people are in agreement on that. If we thought there was a benefit, then there would be a reason to keep them on. But
I completely agree. And I think from our perspective at Vital Voices, I mean, I think the way that we see this is, one, I think you when you start reaching out to some of the world's most admired, influential leaders, both in government, out of government, Malala Yousafzai, Nadia Murad, Nobel laureates, Lema Bowie, so many of these extraordinary women, and they immediately say yes. And then you show that sign of force. I think it allows people to see that there is a large, diverse constituency who absolutely believes in this, right? And that they should be removed, and is willing to put their name, to a letter in the New York Times to say that and come together. And I think that in and of itself is incredibly powerful. I think certainly, hopefully, word gets back to women in Iran of that. But I think also it encourages, and I think it has played a role in encouraging, whether it's the US government, Canada, New Zealand, in stepping forward in bigger ways, understanding that there are other people and countries and leaders who believe the same way. So I don't know, Zainab, if you want to chime in to that as well.
I mean, it takes me back from, both growing up in a war zone as well as working in war zones. And you have to understand that people inside the countries, whatever the countries are going through, feel that the world has forgotten about them, and they need the connection, and they need emotionally the connection that the world is hearing us and is supporting us. So never underestimate the publicity stunt, actually, because it's emotionally very important for them. All what we're saying is, we hear you, we will not forget about you. And the truth of the matter, the danger is we will. Right? I mean, that's the danger. I mean, last year in August of 2021, we worked day and night to evacuate Afghan women, right? And, a year later, we are not thinking about Afghan women day and night, but they're still existing, and they're still suffering, and they're still kicked out of the schools, and and so our job is to continue some connection, to say, I hear you, keep going. It's a moral support, to say the least, beside the tactical, the political support, all of these things. But that moral support goes a long way. It's emotional for me, because you feel you're in a dark hole and no one is hearing you, right? And to just have these lights, I mean, we have Oprah Winfrey signing up to that letter, right? For many would say, oh, it's just Oprah. For there, it's a big deal. It's because it's borrowed power. It's borrowed power saying Oprah is supporting me. And I've witnessed that over and over. Michelle Obama is supporting me. Thus, my voice matters. And yes, we may be cynical about it here, talking about it in America. That is not the truth. And that's not how it felt in different countries. And when you are in the middle of it. So it's, we have to keep going. And yes, if it's called publicity stunt, it's publicity. We just have to keep going, whatever it is, to tell them, you're here, we hear you, you exist, we will not forget, and we will keep on doing that until you are safe. And that's our job right now.
Thank you. So here's another question. Let's see, what does change look like on the ground in a realistic scenario that would be palpable for the IRI and, more importantly, acceptable to the population? Gissou, you want to?
So I wanted to just note one thing before I move on to answering the question, which has come up a little bit in the questions and also in what we've been discussing around publicity or sharing on social or, you know, performative activism and why it actually matters. So just speaking from an advocate's perspective, when I need to elevate this in the priority level of governmental decision makers in a very saturated crisis space, because as we noted just last year, Afghanistan, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and all the global actions that are being taken on that, the fact that there was just a resolution at the Human Rights Council about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. It's a crowded crisis space, and that is horrible and really says a lot about where we are as a globe, not to mention climate change, you know, not to mention all of the other issues, right? In order for governmental decision makers or multilateral decision makers to care, to think, oh, well, this is worth doing, they need to see the noise, frankly. I mean, you would think they wouldn't need to, and that it would be on the merits of the situation. But I think we can all acknowledge that where is Afghanistan in the news right now? Truly, the fact that girls can't go to school there, I'm not sure that everybody even knows that necessarily. And that's so horrific. So that attention really matters. It's not just performative. It's not just, you know, sharing things on social. It actually ties back to what advocates will then want to do. So it's not only, it's first and foremost, the people in the country see that and it means something to them. So Zainab is exactly right. And that's what they tell us too, by the way. But it also matters for the decision makers on the outside. And it's going to matter for the calculus of the Islamic Republic of Iran as well. So officials have been making comments in private meetings and things like that about how they're very concerned about the striking oil workers, because that was one of the striking bodies of folks during the revolution of 1979. So they're paying attention, so it matters. And in terms of, you know, what does a compromise scenario look like or something like this, I think nothing is going to be acceptable for women and girls and for people in Iran who've had their basic human rights denied without their human rights being respected. I think that's a baseline. But we'll let them drive the change, and we need to make sure that we're amplifying their demands. So our only job is to make sure that their demands are being heard. And right now that's the demand. They want to have their basic human dignity and human rights. What I would encourage foreign governments to do is, when it comes to their foreign policy, to not be so set, you know, to really look at how they can support Iran's people and not support the state. Because for too long, the foreign policy has been all about just the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and kind of orienting around that. And there's been almost a complete blank spot or blind spot on any domestic issues in the country and how that sort of played into things. A whole parallel track to discuss human rights was completely discarded, you know, and now we find ourselves here today. So that's what I would urge.
Thank you. We have one last question. We have actually many more questions that have come in, but we only have time for one more. And this is, I think, a great question to close on. And Zainab, I'm going to turn to you, because you touched on this at the beginning of the conversation. I think it's one of the reasons that all of us at Vital Voices and throughout our global network have really dug in on this as well. Just to talk about what's at stake for all women, right? Even if they don't have ties to Iran, what should non-Iranian women with no political ties, why should they care about this movement as well?
Well, to start with, we're all interconnected. I mean, our rights in one country impacts our rights in other countries. We're part of the one. When one of us are harmed, we're all are harmed. And one of us is helped, we are all helped. So that's, for me, it's just the larger philosophy. But we are in a very pivotal moment right now in women's rights generally. I mean, a few years ago, Alyse, we were celebrating some accomplishments and we thought that we are halfway in the mountains in terms of women's rights. We're facing mudslides and earthquakes that is getting women's rights way back in the bottom of the mountain that we have worked so hard to climb in the last few decades, right? And so it's very, very critical. I see it as very interconnected to women losing their freedom to do whatever they want to do with their bodies and their pregnancies in America, as it is to the freedom of Iranian women, whether they want to wear headscarf or not, or whether they want to walk or not, or express themselves in any way, or it's all, for me, interconnected. So we are in this pivotal moment that we have to show that solidarity. Now, let me take a step back for a second. Before the Me Too movement, as a woman of color who's working with women in different parts of the world, it was a constant frustration for me that women's rights were seen as only these poor women issues and these other countries' issues. Thankfully, to the Me Too movement, you have Hollywood stars, the top of the top, saying, oh, this also happened to me. It created a level of solidarities and sisterhood and showed the equal treatment between all of us, regardless of how wealthy or how famous we are or how poor and marginalized we are, that discrimination and sexism and patriarchy is consistent in its manifestation, just it manifests itself in different ways, depends on who you are, right? Now, it's the same thing as it relates to international relationships and to this particular women-led revolution, most magnificent women-led revolution thus far, right? And so we have to see the interconnection with it, because we're basically narrating the story of solidarity, which is emotionally important, of solidarity, which is legally important, because these countries are watching each other. Maybe not the US in terms of women's rights, but definitely the entire Middle East, I assure you, is watching what's happening in Iran as it relates to women and this particular revolution, right? So it is interconnected. So that solidarity, showing that we are supporting each other and we've got each other's back, is hugely important politically, economically, legally, and socially and emotionally, most important, I would say. And so we're at the bottom of the mountain again. We can only go back up when we have each other's back, basically. And this is the moment that can demonstrate that. And I have to say that Vital Voices, seriously, from the bottom of my heart, has shown up leadership in that way, in solidarity, in showing that we've got your back in every way, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is Iran at the moment. So it's really, you're demonstrating what does that sisterhood mean and what does that solidarity mean. And for that, I am personally very, very grateful for your leadership.
Oh, thank you so much, Zainab. And thank you, Gissou, as well. And for all of you joining us, and for those who I know will join us and listen to these really compelling and fascinating discussion and words from both of you. I just want to urge everyone, before we officially sign off, to go to the website, sign the petition, get on social media, ask your friends, your family. Don't be afraid to dig in. Don't be afraid to be part of this conversation. Just in the last hour, another 200 people have signed on. We now have over 69,000 people who've signed on, but we need far more than that. So the website, again, is Woman, Life, freedom.today. You can also go to Vital Voices website to learn more about other actions that you can take. We need you to push on your governments to do the right thing, to stand up and to be part of this emerging group of countries and leaders who have said enough. And it is time to remove the IRI from the Commission on the Status of Women. So thank you all again for joining us. And we look forward to chatting more with you offline. Thank you. Bye-bye.